thank you all for joining. I wish I could be with all of you in person, but I look forward to that day. But this is also what our technologies afford, the ability to reach so many in so many different places. And it's something I think we need to remember as well. The internet started in many ways, not only as a taxpayer-funded network, but as a distributed network where, in theory, any of us could be publishers, creators, all our voices could count. So I think it's important that we remember that and we try to look at that as a North Star. So thank you, Fergal, thank you, Limor, thank you, Luisa, and thank you to the Redico team for having me. And honored to be part of this conference. It's awesome. I saw my friend Ethan Zuckerman was speaking yesterday. He's one of my favorite people and, and colleagues. So it's just wonderful to be part of this mix with all of you. I will share some slides and then we will, I'll probably go about 40 minutes or so, and then we can have a conversation afterward. And let's also keep the conversation going. You all are welcome, anyone's welcome to stay in contact with me directly. And I always try to be in contact with anybody and everybody who reaches out. Okay, here we go. Okay, working okay, right, everybody? Okay, great, fantastic.
Very good.
Okay, so there are a couple ways to reach me. There's my website, there's the Twitter handle, and so on. And as Fergan kindly mentioned, one of the best ways to keep up with what I'm up to, which is quite wild and expansive at this point, is through our podcast, which is completely non-commercial. And this is called the Utopias podcast. Noting fully well that Thomas More himself, when he wrote the book Utopia, he meant it satirically. And the goal of the podcast is not necessarily to carve out or identify or establish some sort of utopia, but as much as to look at that again as a North Star, as Polaris, right? As a way to try to think about what a world could look like, what a world that's increasingly completely almost saturated now by data and digital media technologies could look like in the image where all beings benefit. Here, I'm not just speaking about human beings, which of course we know there's gross inequalities tied with the current deployments and expansions of digital technologies, mainly because of Western and American, specifically corporate platforms, but also the idea of non-humans as well. And I think the key point that this podcast is about and that I want to emphasize is for us to think about a new set of design challenges, even engineering challenges that recognize mutual gain of all systems, rather than considering and designing technologies in these kind of implicitly antagonistic ways, where Fergal's benefit is my loss somehow, or and many of you must be experiencing this. We're experiencing it in our worlds today. We're certainly experiencing it here in the United States, where people quickly get articulated or classified or identified as in-group or out-group. And this is also what underlying digital technologies have sort of created. They've created these invisible borders. And what I want us to think about, and what all my guests engage with in lots of different ways, and quite wild sets of ways, is an increasingly borderless digital world, a world where actually all our voices count and we're actually able to talk to and listen to one another. So given that, I have quite a wide range of guests that have been on the podcast. Andrew Yang, who ran for president a few years ago, Dr. Cornel West, who's something of a, we could say, philosophical, intellectual, and we could even say spiritual mentor to myself. Kevin Roose, the New York Times technology journalist. And on the right is, I think, one of the smarter people in our US Congress on digital and tech issues, the Representative Ro Khanna. Many of these are connections that are tied to my involvement 4 years ago with Senator Bernie Sanders' national campaign, for which I wrote some policy and was a national surrogate. For many of us, this was our best shot to also look at what one thing maybe many of us remember and still experience to this day, tied to the internet, that everybody could actually make a small donation or a small amount of participation, and we could create sort of value out of the crowd, right? So we were, the donations in this campaign were $18 in the last round, $27 in 2016, and more small donations than any campaign in the history of this country, which actually led to, it's not just about donations, but led to a massive wave of popular support, right? This is the idea that the internet need not to be dominated simply by, data hoarding platforms and tech, I would say increasingly oligarchs, but actually all of us could be part of the crowd to make things happen. And this is what the Sanders campaign was all about. So The podcast also has, you all are based in Europe. The former Greek Minister of Finance, Yanis Varoufakis, has joined us, and a lot of other folks. I've even brought some monks on because I do believe also that there's something about our psychological health and loneliness that also is directly tied to the invisible enclosures and I think carceral spaces that are now tied to algorithmic and digital technologies. So I'll start with this. I wonder if any of you remember this or have seen this cartoon. I know it's very grainy. That's because it's quite old. It's from 1993. Many of us were not born in 1993. Some of us certainly were. And this is a cartoon that actually extolled the virtues of the internet and and the emerging web at that time. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. This was seen, as I said, it extolled the internet, right? Meaning it praised it. The anonymity of all of us being able to be not just who we are in this sort of idea of identity in a place-based or tradition-based way, but we could explore. Our identities could be somewhat fluid. We could navigate new spaces. We could grow in ways that were not built upon intimate, constant, 24/7, 365 surveillance, right? How interesting, right? Now, two things. One is we're not only known for being dogs, but we're known so much that our intimate sort of psychological predictions can be gleaned. One, two. The major point that was not mentioned in this cartoon, and of course probably they wouldn't have predicted it to come to be, or maybe some would have, is that everything about the self and identity has been turned into data, right? So this spoke to a moment where both surveillance was not part of the internet, as well as the internet was dominantly a non-commercial, public-oriented, civic-oriented, per Ethan's work, space. And I just think this is very, very notable, right? Because now anonymity and confidentiality seems to be more tied to the mysterious forces that drive our behavior, that perhaps construct our senses of desire and construct consumption, right? And so the anonymous forces that seem to be pushing us are invisible algorithmic platform driven forces, including ones driving generative AI systems, rather than us being anonymous to actually explore things in a more, we could say, a more radically democratic way where we can have different kinds of identities. And I think that's a very notable point, right? From trolls to false identities to the inability to trust information we see online, much of which could be generated by generative AI systems, to the invisibility of the forces that drive our behavior and our emotions and our psychologies, right? Notable examples like Cambridge Analytica and more showed this. So I want us to just take stock of this all. Also, in part, I know this is a 32-year-old cartoon, but to also make to emphasize the point that even the dominant platforms that seem to be driving much of our lives and have amassed the greatest amount of wealth and power in the history of the world are babies. So when we're talking about like a Meta/Facebook, we're talking about a story that's, more or less 20 years old, right? Even 10 to 15 years old ago, there was a robust discussion about whether, and it was called Web 2.0 at that time, as many of us will remember, whether these social media platforms might be actually good for everybody. Here Comes Everybody was the title of Clay Shirky's book way back at that time. Now I think the jury is out that actually everybody's not actually part of this participation, but it does happen at times, like we saw in the Sanders campaign. We see it in many examples of social movements, but we also know that all of our exchanges, peer-to-peer exchanges online, are being swooped up by a Pac-Man that's grabbing everything and taking all the data and using it for God knows what, other than in a short-term way to construct and influence our behavior and our digital patterns, but also in many ways potentially for the retention and aggregation of data, right? Meaning here, I know in the EU you all have better policies protecting this, but it's one thing for, when I'm on Facebook or Instagram for data about me to be known. It's another for that data to be aggregated with data of what I buy at the supermarket, right? That's data aggregation. So we need to think about data practices, collection, aggregation, and retention. Should data about me when I was 18 years old be available to third parties, I'm not even sure whom, when I'm, let's say, in my 40s, like now? So these are all the things we want to navigate through. So this is all the key, I think, that's grafted upon when we look at these AI systems as we know them, right? It's important that everyone understands that the generative AI systems of today and certainly moving into tomorrow are all worth what they're worth because of our data. Without everything being turned into data or datafication, all of that cannot be calculated, right? Life has become calculable primarily through correlation, right? And if you actually think about how human intelligence functions, as I'll allude to later, correlation and pattern recognition is but one small part of our intelligence. So the reason why I'm saying all this is turning anything into data with massive astronomical expenses, ecologically and otherwise, um, bring up big questions about what are the right types of design for such systems if they are to be designed at all. And they certainly are being designed, right? And the DeepSeek revelations relative to the astronomical costs tied to Project Stargate, which President Trump announced in his first week of office with Sam Altman from OpenAI, as well as Larry Ellison, shows that you can, for pennies on the dollar, as we say, you can actually develop and refine large language model technologies that can emulate much of OpenAI's technologies and ChatGPT's technologies. The reason I'm saying all that is we have to ask questions about the expenses and costs that are put into the design of these systems and really understand what is or is not making them work. Now, it was a misnomer to say that it was $5 million to train the Chinese DeepSeek model versus, I think it was like 200, well, it was well over $100 million. But the Stargate initiative was even more. But it's apples to apples, right? The training of the models was done, we could just say that, much less expensively, much more inexpensively. And that's partly because they were using open source data and dev communities, which is one of the most important parts of the internet, past and present, the open source and free software community. And they were designing these systems using different expert models to link them with one another. So this gets to points about how are these systems being designed? Should everything be gathered with massive astronomical expenses, empty promises around labor and economic security, no compensation for pretty much everybody, no disclosure around the surveillance and data that are being used? Or can we design things in agile, resource conscious ways and try to understand what, if any, role do these types of technologies have in what context with what guardrails, right? So throughout human history and today, life has always been based on entanglements between humans, non-humans, right? Flora, fauna, plants, trees, etc., and things and technologies, right? But the point being, what are the relationships between these, and what are the forces behind these technologies, and how are they? And can we restore a sense of balance to all of this? So this is getting at, I think, the first part of this talk, which is a sort of critique of what I think is occurring here, a lot of related to a new book I'm working on as well. Many of us feel this sense that this digital world seems to be dissociating or disconnecting us with ourselves, with one another, and with our planet, right? So with one another, when we talk about algorithms that kind of invisibly create in-group, out-group outcomes. With ourselves directly tied to a lot of concern here, at least in the US, around what the former Surgeon General under President Biden called an epidemic of loneliness. I don't know how many of us start and end our days with our phones in our beds with us, just like maybe a partner or a loved one would be. I wonder how many of us start and end our days looking at these things. But I want to ask you all, what a healthy relationship would be if you thought of this phone as another human being, like a husband or wife or a child, right? Is it a healthy relationship to be so close to someone or something that is spying on you constantly, using what is known about you to influence and shape your emotions or behavior? Or would that be considered an unhealthy relationship? Similarly, we have to consider our relationships with these technologies, given the level of intimacy we have with them, accordingly. And that is why I think it's just so powerful and important for us to re-examine our relationships to ourselves and how much of our lives are being sped up with the feeling that the future is kind of constantly unfolding upon us faster than ever, tied to these technologies. They're always on, they're never off, and there's always speed tied with all of it. With one another, as I discussed with many sorts of systems and even with our planet, right? What is tends to be very under discussed is what resources from our planet form this digital world, from energy sources to cooling water sources to rare earth minerals, including how devices like this that are designed to die planned obsolescence may return to the earth and create waste, right? So this is actually a planetary question, and there are these disconnections that seem to have been set in and that seem to be agreed upon by many of us. And then we have to think about technologies that actually build bridges with ourselves, with one another, and with the planet. So this is what I was alluding to earlier, healthy versus abusive relationships. So similarly, what I am concerned about, and I've already alluded to it, is the kind of flattening of life that seems to occur when we let kind of tech for tech's sake, big tech, take basically dominate and drive everything, and the rest of us are sort of flummoxed and anxious and not unsure of what to do about all of it. I think there's an incredible reduction of even intelligence itself. I was a former student of Marvin Minsky's, and I even saw this back when I was at MIT. I have an engineering training that turned into the social sciences, and now I think more than ever I have to be at least largely, if not partly, in the humanities, because we have to ask questions about what does it mean to be human and what life should be like. But when I was in Dr. Minsky's class, we were talking about I was talking about emotional intelligence. I think we can also argue that analytical intelligence, which is partly correlation and stochastic probabilistic inference based, which is how these generative AI systems function, is just one type of intelligence. But also the type of intelligence we were working with when we were building AI systems at MIT was a certain kind of semantic intelligence, rational intelligence, the ability to make meaning of things. And that's not how these systems function. These systems are exquisite at emulating behavior, at simulating behavior, at appearing human-like, but that's because of the data being gathered upon us and the ability to do very high accuracy, increasingly correlation to basically emulate expression. But they're not interpreting, they're not semantic, and so on. So we can also ask questions about other types of intelligence like non-humans, birds, fungi, bees, ants. They have what one might call distributed cognition. And this was a point that Bruno Latour was sort of interested in before he passed away, I recall, the famed French sociologist, and folks like Edward Hutchins and other scholars of sociocognition have pointed out. And we just have to ask that question. I want to just invite you all, feel free to take this question, ask it to your students, ask it to yourselves, ask it to your family. Let me ask all of you, what data, if any, could or should be captured about you that can truly capture your identity? You're in charge, not mysterious third-party forces. Not you're in charge, not Mark Zuckerberg, right? Like you can list out every type of data that has to be turned into something quantifiable, series of ones and zeros. What could truly capture you as a living being? Is that possible? Knowing fully well that who I am with all of you, I can only see 3 of you right now, relates to my looking at your expressions, who's coming, who's turning on their camera, who's turning it off, the time of the day, the coffee I just drank, the meditation I just did, right? I'm presenting myself to you as in a relational way and a contextual way, because we human beings always are changing. We're always changing. We're impermanent beings and we're relational beings. So can we, if this was truly democratic, which it's the opposite in my opinion right now, can life be quantifiable? Can life be computable? If so, in what ways? Around what context? Around what domains? And I just think that this is a big question as everything and anything gets turned into data, including, of course, even the human genome, right? The human genome itself has become more and more privatized and commodified. So data has become a mode of commodification, and it's something that we really have to intervene within and ask questions about what is the sacred, what is the human, what should exist outside of regimes of calculation and computation. Because, and we know this story, the biggest and wealthiest companies in the history of the world are in the business of owning almost nothing and hiring almost nobody. That's a hell of a business deal. I'm in a small town right now in California, and I'm a musician as well. Some of you who know me know that. and a DJ, and I was like hanging out with some friends and artists here, and they were mentioning, oh yeah, there's just not enough bodies here, and there's not enough money here yet for Uber Eats to come here. And then we were talking about how this was a friend who used to live in Los Angeles. How when he would order food from Uber Eats, something that would be $10, he'd end up paying like $23 for. It would be cold, and the extra $13, next to none of it would actually go to the delivery person. So these peer-to-peer platforms, technologies, are actually not just grabbing data as intermediaries, but actually capitalizing on the transactions with potentially disastrous concerns for a future of work and a future of workers and a future of labor. And of course, we can imagine this world where we can all just relax and let these technologies do the work for all of us. But we know that's not the direction it's being headed in when we see widening and amplifying inequalities more than ever tied to these directions of big tech. Note, and for everybody, and this is something I talked to Varoufakis about, the decoupling of stock valuations and gross domestic product as an example. So during the pandemic, there was a certain date. I wrote about it. I can tell you the date later. And it was where the S&P 500, which is dominated by tech stocks, was at its highest point, I think in history. And at least in the U.S., our gross domestic product was at a local minima, which means there's a decoupling of these measurements of traditional capitalism, right? Tech stocks are booming, but actual profitability and macroeconomic outcomes, forget more progressive statistics like labor, inequality coefficients, et cetera, are decoupled from one another. So we have to ask questions about where tech is taking us and whether these platforms are actually in the economic interests of all of us. And if not, what can be done about those issues? And this is just but an example, right? You think about if you juxtapose these two headlines from the same date with one another, the IMF no less, warning that 40% of jobs might be transformed. Now that study, which The Economist has also written about, has gotten some critique, but at the same time, it's clear from the gig economy that the traditional social contract, right? The social contract, here we go to Rousseau, even is no longer secure. That there's precarity in terms of not just access to secure labor, but access to secure economic security. And so you can see this sort of move toward more and more valuation kinds of oriented dimensions and stock portfolios, and the rate of return on stocks is much higher than gross domestic product growth. That's a point that Thomas Piketty made in his book Capital. So we got to ask questions about where this is all going to go, and we have to consider everybody around the planet, including in the global south. I think especially in the global south, places like Africa, South America, South Asia, etc. So initial research has also shown that AI systems, generative AI systems, tend to do what unfortunately even Wikipedia did, which is flatten informational diversity. This is a point that Darren Acemoglu, who won the Nobel Prize this past year, made in conversation with me. Darren will be joining our podcast soon, and Darren and I both work on some AI economics issues. That's why I've been really focused on the economic issues, because what we're living through here in the United States right now is directly tied to economic populism, or perhaps some empty promises being made around that by some of our political leaders. So Darren has pointed out in some initial studies that we find that most generative AI systems tend to pattern dominant tropes. And that's something we've seen already with kind of algorithmic bias issues and other kinds of issues, that even Wikipedia followed this pattern, as lovely and wonderful and important as Wikipedia is, in my opinion, where it was dominantly authored and edited by male global North folks. So this promise of this internet, this distributed network paid for by US taxpayers, first node starts on my campus at UCLA, has been the same pattern that we've seen again and again, which is socialize the costs and privatize the profits. So it's really a possibility again to imagine that AI itself could represent the diverse sets of worldviews that exist around our planet rather than reduce and flatten them. And this is why I've argued this is when I was working on the Sanders campaign back in 2020 for what we called a digital Bill of Rights that recognizes that our experiences online can't be piecemeal, they're interdependent, right? So, like my questions around data and the value of my data or compensation for my data, which is something Jaron Lanier has talked about, or other kinds of proposals like universal basic income that Andrew Yang, who joined us, tried to popularize 4 years ago, or more than 4 years ago when he ran for president. That's one realm. Surveillance is another realm. Data capture and aggregation is another realm. What we need is expansive, intersecting legislation that touches on all of these. And, I was just in Germany speaking at a very kind of glitzy called Tech Europe conference with a bunch of German ministers there. And, they were essentially really upset about how European regulations, they claim, are the reason why Europe is not up to speed with the US. And I was saying, hey, you may not want to go exactly down our path right now. And I don't mean just in terms of the political situation, I mean in terms of the incredibly widening inequality. However, there can be a way to more elegantly introduce regulations so it's not 27 nation states in piecemeal ways kind of building, their own versions and it being incredibly inefficient. You can think about innovation around protection and innovation around technology design at the same time. And I think that's a key point here. So this was a piece I wrote basically arguing for much of what has been implemented in Europe, but in a much more systemically elegant way back in those days. So as I alluded to, there have been predictions throughout history that advancing technologies and automated technologies, everybody please note, automated technologies did not start with generative AI. The forklift is an automated technology. Assembly line technologies in industrial factories are automated technologies. The question always is who benefits, right? Can we all reap the benefits? Obviously, understanding that those investors or creators might get more, right? But at the same time, it doesn't have to be all zero sum. It doesn't have to be what Varoufakis is arguing is an increasingly feudal type of system. So decades ago, the famed economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that advancing technologies would mean we'd all be working 15 hours. I think most of us know that that has not come to be. Right before President Biden left office, Senator Sanders introduced a proposal for a 32-hour work week. That got essentially, I wouldn't say laughed off the floor, but it didn't even get any serious consideration whatsoever. So you can imagine this world where we work less and we focus our incredible talents as human beings on things that might be non-commercial. We do the things that actually can help us all with health, with care, with creativity, all these things, while actually getting enough resources from these incredible technologies that use all our data, that use an internet we all paid for to benefit us all, but that has not yet come to be. And so there's a question of how we can actually get there. And the real question would also be, what are the right economic proposals? Is it to identify new forms of work that work with these machines, right? Understanding that work in its traditional formulations has always changed. Is it about paying people for their data? Well, that doesn't necessarily change the underlying architecture of the system. Is a universal basic income? Again, many would argue that's a very neoliberal policy because it doesn't, again, change the underlying architecture of extraction. Varoufakis has called for a universal basic dividend where all of us, based on some small component, I mean, it could be blockchain based, of our data could gain equity in any of these companies, right? So a certain, micro percentage of my data is being used by Uber, for example. Then as Uber's stock valuations appreciate, we have some small dividend in Uber. I don't think they're going to want any of those things, but sometimes in life you have to have checks and balances to make sure things occur. Right now we're facing, right now in our country, the absence of those checks and balances, and we can see what is occurring right now. So this is also because I think a key part of what makes all these systems feel frictionless, smooth, elegant, they're always on, always working, is the hidden labor and the pernicious nature of that labor, including, the story of content moderators is well known. Deutsche Welle had a great documentary about this called that I helped them with a little bit, called The Cleaners, about social media, mainly focused on the Philippines. But the story also, even with the AI systems, well, not even, certainly with the AI systems is, we see independent contractors through third parties who are not employees of Meta or of OpenAI, working 12 to 14 hours days, looking at pornography all day, looking at extreme violence all day, and having massive jarring psychological effects, getting paid very, very poorly. This has become a mainstream issue here in the US, thanks to national coverage by networks like 60 Minutes about all of this, right? So the point I want to make is what part of the tech business model that drives this S&P 500 as well is the idea that you can always offshore, just like debt. You can keep offshoring the costs. You can kind of like, oh, yeah, they're later, they're external. We'll deal with it later. Like energy costs, like cooling costs, like these labor costs, right? They're, kind of like these are what are called externalities by economists. And it's absolutely critical that we actually internalize the externalities so we can actually develop systems that actually recognize all the kind of costs and benefits. And we can do that in a very sober and level-headed way. We don't need to be all, affective in how we experience this. So this is to basically kind of get to the point of what a new type of vision could look like. And I'm just going to be fairly brief on this so we have enough time because I know I have about 10 more minutes till we can take some questions. A new vision for me would recognize and take a long view historically. So I think part of it is looking way at the past and way toward the future rather than this kind of collapsing future that's constantly being fed to us on our devices. But part of it is also looking widely. And Fergal mentioned my first book, Whose Global Village. I've written two others since then. The last one was written quite journalistically while I was working on the Sanders campaign. And in Whose Global Village, I end by asking us to not kind of fixate on technologies as world making, knowing that we're not the ones necessarily making those worlds. It's really a few engineers and investors and executives, many of whom don't have much faith in humanity or this planet, but world listening, right? And by the way, that's extremely fun. It's it's inspiring. I've learned so much in my career by working with different communities all around the planet. And that has allowed me to challenge all of my assumptions as a former engineer, as a trained engineer, around building it for them. Actually, instead of building together, creating together, listening, shutting up sometimes, and that kind of vision has actually it lifts the hood off of what our planet is, which is an incredibly, well, it's first of all the only place we've ever known life to exist. Second of all, it's remarkably and beautifully diverse with all sorts of languages and cultures and traditions and ecosystems and all of this. Can we not embrace and remember and work with all of it rather than extract and tunnel and flatten it as we conceive of digital futures that actually lift us all up? So here I often think about my own teacher, the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. It's a very kind of personal thing with me, but I practice meditation. I mentioned I was just sitting before our event today, and Thai, he's a Vietnamese Zen monk. He was close to Martin Luther King. He had an incredible monastery in France, and protested the Vietnam War, which is rare for monks to actually get politically active. But he ended up, because he was anti-war in all forms. But the key point that Thai often makes is non-dualism, right? So he sort of says something that's very beautiful. There are many key points, but I'll just say this, that actually the lotus flower doesn't exist without the soil, without the mud. He says the mud. Mud is less glamorous than soil. That actually the mud and the flower are the same. So it's that sort of logic of recognizing interdependence, that maybe we're all in it together on this planet, even though some of our friends in tech, and I went to school with many of them, want to create private islands. They want to head out to space, maybe leave the rest of us here. It doesn't seem like space is too accommodating right now, but okay. Mr. Musk keeps exploding rockets with SpaceX. well, NASA actually gets the job done in potentially detecting other forms of life in other parts of the planet. Not just NASA, but international, public, government-funded space programs, right? So do we want to just like leave and take off, but if we only know life to actually exist here in the here and now, or do we want to think more deeply about how to heal and build together? So part of this is first vision is one of really, I know it's a bit of a bureaucratic term, but really diving into this vision of a circular economy, right? That's critical. Now they talk about that at Davos. they talk about that in all sorts of contexts and circumstances, but can that actually be implemented outside of sort of bureaucratic patronizing language, right? So I actually do field work. I love working in different communities, different contexts. It's very important for me to not write about people as much as write about how creativity and culture and beliefs and values might transform the ways we look at technology. And this is in the biggest open air market. I've been going there for the last 3, 4 years in all of Africa, called Mercato. I don't know if any of you have been there. This is a funny story, but you see in Mercato tens of thousands sometimes, not just Mercato, open air markets in Kenya, Tanzania, other regions as well that I've spent time with. You see all the shirts and all the caps of whoever loses the World Cup or the Super Bowl or the World Series or the NBA championship. And I have, right, because they make thousands and thousands of both sides. And where do you think these things end up, right? And where do things that are designed to die, that are necropolitical, per my colleague Achille Bembe's conceptualization of this? He's a big influence on me. Well, they often end up in these places, but do people just sort of cry about it, or do they repair? Bringing back together, taking things that have been fragmented, right? Repair, bringing it back together. Just look at the etymology of that word. Recycle, bring it back into a cycle of life, right? Regenerate, bring it back into a form of life that can generate. And this is what I see. I see everything and anything being repaired, not by people who went to fancy universities, but actually by people who learn by doing, learn from one another. The market is a complex social system, and this is what I've been seeing at this particular. It's a special market on Sunday in Mercato that's called Min Aleshtera, which in Amharic means "What have you got?" Bring anything. What have you got? As a fun little example of that, we can even I'll tell you is Ethiopians are very proud of their coffee. But there's somehow Nescafe trash bottles end up there. And they'll even fix up the Nescafe bottles, but they'll make sure they take the Nescafe label off so there's no trace of it being Nescafe. And then they'll pour their good coffee, their great coffee, in those bottles. So you can see that kind of vision, that vision of I'm gonna hustle and work with whatever I've got to create value. I'm gonna breathe life into that which is dead. I'm gonna create value out of that which is waste. And I think that's deeply inspiring. And I think there's a possibility for us to learn from these kinds of visions and introduce policies and systems that are truly planetary that can deal with these issues. So I've even written extensively about how in nearby Nairobi, there are folks that are called themselves Jua Kali. Jua Kali means hot sun in Swahili. And they, instead of it being like a complaint, they actually love it. They think it's fun to call themselves Jua Kali. It's a table, soldering gun, different screwdrivers under the sun, and they're so proud about it. There's a beer called Jua Kali in Kenya, and a market called Jua Kali, and they have built 3D printers out of all electronic waste, almost all, not about 80%, and including the plastic itself. Right, this 3D printers print with something called filament that's made of a type of plastic. They can't afford that. They don't know how to buy that. So they even use physics principles to turn plastic trash bottles into that filament that then print 3D printers. So it's incredibly recursive. And with the 3D printers, who cares about a 3D printer? But with the 3D printers, they're printing microscopes that are now in schools that never could have afforded them before. They're printing medical devices that could have never accessed them before. See this? This is an idea of not just profound creativity, working with what you got, rather than pulling from mysterious sources and potentially draining the planet or its people. working with what you got, and incredible, profound amounts of both creativity and care. Care. They're showing care because they're printing things to try to help one another and create a business at the same time. Wow, what a vision, right? That's actually very basic and very fundamental, yet actually modeled for me by people like Roy. Roy actually, many folks in Kenya are brilliant engineers, but there's just a big employment set of issues. That's why many who have trained engineering backgrounds have these horrible jobs like working as content moderators for OpenAI. But they're not actually working for OpenAI. OpenAI has done a great job of not taking any liability or responsibility by contracting it out through third parties like Sama. So another example of this that I've been working on is with folks in the Amazon, right, who are building digital networks, use digital objects on your phone, but they can send, these are indigenous land protectors, they can send information about paramilitaries and fossil fuel companies that some of you may know are murdering indigenous peoples on these lands because they're trying to get rid of them so they can do more both mining and fossil fuel extraction. Now these communities are able to send information to one another over 1,500 plus kilometers with no surveillance. How did they do that? No GSM, no Wi-Fi, even though they're using digital objects. They were able to, by working with hackers from Brazil, send those images and objects of things they're detecting using HF ham radio. And this is incredible. This is an incredible way in which you turn a digital object into something that could be sent over an analog high-frequency radio system that actually bounces. The way HF works is it bounces signals, waves, off of the ionosphere. Think about that as a remarkable collaboration between indigenous peoples who are trying to protect and support the planet and their traditions and their lands with those in the hacker and free software community. I'm on the board of an incredible organization that does similar work called Awana Digital. We're working on in many countries with 800 land defenders, over 7 million hectares. These are people using very simple open source but non-trackable mapping technologies to show their connections to the land, indigenous peoples, and are in the courts gaining stewardship of that land back. Note, not private property, right? In certain constitutions, it's like who is best there to protect this land, to care for this land, custodianship of the land. Because in some constitutions, not many, the rights of non-humans are also enshrined. So these people are seen as stewards rather than owners. This is an important distinction as well. So Awana is amazing. They're my dear friends, and I joined their board about 2 years ago. So, all right, these are just a few quick global examples, and we can have a conversation about all of this. But I think what I want to emphasize is something that the Brookings Institute, no less, mentioned in this article. That actually, yes, there have always been entanglements, again, assemblages between humans, non-humans, and technologies. And things. That's always been part of life. That's always been part of life. But we have to understand what we humans do, what our non-human friends do, what these technologies do, and try to think about what we do well amidst all of this, and what we wish for amidst all of us. And I think curiosity and creativity are part of the key. This is why, as a professor at UCLA, someone who lives in Los Angeles, I have friends in the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild. We saw massive strikes occurring around these issues to try to get some protections. And this gets me to a point that we can have actually, instead of it being all black boxes, we can have open dialogues. This is a point that John Stuart Mill made centuries ago, that democracy is not just about like voting. Even the Aristotelian vision of democracy is completely different than many democracies today. But the demos is actually also about dialogue. And I want to just ask you, well, how many times have you had a healthy political debate on social media in the last couple of years? Do any of you? Doesn't go very well, right? Instead, we can renew dialogue, not by turning to these opaque systems that construct controversy and division, but by actually having real dialogues. And here I just want to kind of point out what is I'm sure this has been making the rounds and some of you have seen this. It's like, I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so I can do my laundry and dishes. And, as a reminder, for those of you here in Europe, like, remember the Bauhaus. This is something I said in front of all these, in this Tech Europe conference, in front of all these, German ministers and tech executives and people from Siemens and S&P, SAP and all these companies, Bayer. I was like, hey, y'all remember Walter Gropius? I mean, it wasn't just Gropius. It was a pan-European movement. And in the Bauhaus, they talked about a vision of a future economy that had a commercial component, but also had a creativity and care component. And maybe the creativity and care sides would not be subject to the same rules of profitability and self-maximization of the commercial vision of the economy. Can't we design new types of systems, not just technological ones, but socio-technical ones that actually recognize that it should never be about technology. It should be about life. It should be about life. And that's, kind of where I want to leave you all. In Germany, I was very fortunate, I would say blessed to be with Maria Ressa, who's a big hero of mine, a wonderful person, sweet, sweet, kind person, who's trying to do that to renew and restore democracy and journalism in the Philippines, using federated servers in connection with one another, just as an example of alternative modes of organizing to support journalism and not get infiltrated by platforms that privilege disinformation and tend to privilege controversy and extreme positions, and at times even are now subject to the creation of and dissemination of content that is not even real, that's not authentic, that's created by AI systems, that's created by dogs. So, sort of a vision for the future, right? We can look to the past, we can look around the world, we can world listen rather than world make. We all have to reactivate the demos to make this digital world work for all of us, and recognizing that it should never be about itself. It should be about serving the inhabitants, the custodians of our planet. So with that, I would love to get some input from you all, and thank you all for having me.